The dust from the stagecoach wheels had barely settled when Martha Calloway realized the driver was not coming back for her, and standing there with her worn carpet bag at her feet and the afternoon sun beating down on her shoulders, she understood with a sinking certainty that she had just been abandoned in a town she did not know, with exactly $3.17 to her name. The town of Redemption, New Mexico Territory, stretched out before her in 1881 with all the promise of a graveyard, its wooden buildings bleached gray by the relentless sun and its dusty main street empty, except for a few horses tied to hitching posts and a dog that looked too tired to bark. Martha pressed her hand to her stomach, trying to settle the nausea that had been her constant companion for the past week, ever since she had fled Santa Fe with nothing but the clothes on her back and the desperate hope that distance would somehow solve her problems. She had paid the stagecoach driver the last of her money to bring her here, thinking this remote town might offer her a fresh start. But now she realized she had made a terrible mistake because she had nowhere to sleep tonight and no prospects for work, and the sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. She picked up her bag and walked slowly down the main street, her boots raising small clouds of dust with each step, and she tried to ignore the stares of the few men who stood outside the saloon, smoking and watching her, with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. Martha had learned in her 22 years that a woman alone was an invitation for trouble, especially in these rough frontier towns where decent women were scarce and assumptions were made quickly. She kept her eyes forward and her chin up, even though inside she felt like crumbling, and she walked past the general store and the bank and the livery stable until she reached the far edge of town, where the buildings gave way to scrubland and the vastness of the desert stretched out endlessly before her. This was where her journey ended, she thought, with a bitter twist of irony, at the edge of nowhere with nowhere to go. She set down her bag and sat on a large rock, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, even though the air was still warm, and she allowed herself one moment of weakness to put her face in her hands and wonder how everything had gone so wrong. 6 months ago, she had been working as a seamstress in Santa Fe, making a modest but honest living, and then she had made the mistake of catching the eye of Richard Thornton, a married banker who had pursued her with flowers and promises and lies. She had believed him when he said he was getting a divorce, believed him when he said they would marry, and by the time she discovered the truth about his wife and his 3 children, and his complete lack of intention to leave any of them, she had already compromised herself beyond repair. When Mrs. Thornton had shown up at Martha's boarding house with 2 large men and a threat to have her arrested for theft of jewelry she had never stolen, Martha had understood immediately that this was how powerful people eliminated inconvenient problems. She could stay and fight charges she could never disprove, or she could run and start over somewhere else. She had chosen to run, and now here she was, at the end of the world, with no prospects and no hope, and nothing but regrets for company. The sound of hoofbeats made her lift her head, and she watched as a rider came down the main street at an easy pace, his horse a beautiful chestnut mare that moved with the kind of grace that spoke of good breeding and better care. The man in the saddle sat tall and relaxed, his dark hat pulled low against the sun, and as he drew closer, Martha could see he was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 25 or 26, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore a simple work shirt and worn denim pants and a gun belt that looked well used but not ostentatious. And there was something about the way he carried himself that suggested capability without arrogance. He slowed his horse as he approached, and Martha tensed, preparing for whatever crude proposition or unwelcome attention might come her way. But instead he simply touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture and said, "Evening, miss. You look like you could use some help." His voice was deep and calm, with a slight drawl that marked him as a man who had spent time in Texas or perhaps further south. And his eyes, when they met hers, were a surprising shade of gray-green that reminded her of sage after rain. Martha straightened her spine and tried to summon what dignity she had left. "I am quite all right, thank you." "With respect, ma'am, you do not look all right." He dismounted in one fluid motion and walked his horse closer, stopping at a distance that was respectful but close enough for conversation. "Name is Daniel Reeves. I work at the Triple Crown Ranch about 10 miles north of here. I come into town once a week for supplies, and in all my time doing that, I have never seen anyone sitting at the edge of town looking quite so lost as you do right now." Martha felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion at his kindness, but she forced herself to maintain composure. "I am simply resting before I continue on my way." "Continue on to where?" Daniel asked gently, and when she did not answer, he nodded as though she had confirmed something he already suspected. "There is nothing out that direction but desert and mountains and a whole lot of ways to die. Sun will be down in a few hours, and the temperature drops fast out here. If you have nowhere to go tonight, you should not be sitting out here alone." "I have money for a hotel," Martha lied, lifting her chin. Daniel glanced back at the town, then returned his attention to her. "Town only has one hotel, and Bill Carson, who runs it, does not rent rooms to single women. Says it gives his establishment a bad reputation." The disgust in his voice told Martha exactly what he thought of that policy. "Look, I can see you are in some kind of trouble, and I am not asking you to tell me your business, but I know a place where you could stay tonight, get a decent meal, and maybe figure out your next step. My boss at the Triple Crown, Mrs. Eleanor Hartfield, she has a big house, and she is always saying it is too empty. She would give you a room for the night, no questions asked." Martha studied his face, searching for any sign of deception or ulterior motive, but all she saw was genuine concern and an openness that she had not encountered in a long time. Still, she had learned to be cautious. "Why would you help a stranger?" "Because somebody helped me once when I needed it," Daniel said simply. "I was 16 years old and half-starved when Mrs. Hartfield found me trying to steal food from her kitchen. Instead of having me arrested, she gave me a job and a place to live and treated me like I was worth something. I figure the least I can do is pass that kindness along when I see someone who needs it." Something in his words struck a chord deep in Martha's chest, some recognition of authenticity that she could not ignore, and she realized that she had a choice to make. She could maintain her pride and spend the night hungry and alone and possibly in danger, or she could accept this unexpected offer of help from a stranger who seemed genuine. She thought about the $3 in her pocket and how far that would stretch, and she thought about the empty desert at her back and the unwelcoming town in front of her, and she made her decision. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you. I would appreciate a safe place to stay tonight." Daniel's face broke into a smile that transformed his features, making him look younger and somehow more approachable, and he gestured to his horse. "Climb up. I know a place." He helped her mount first, then swung up behind her with easy grace, and Martha found herself acutely aware of his presence at her back, the solid warmth of him, and the way his arms came around her to hold the reins. She stiffened instinctively, and he must have felt it because he said quietly, "I will not let you fall. Promise." They rode out of Redemption as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, heading north along a well-worn trail that cut through the scrubland. Daniel kept the horse at a steady pace, not too fast, but purposeful, and after a while Martha found herself relaxing slightly against the rhythm of the ride. The landscape around them was harsh but beautiful in its own way, all rocks and sage and distant mountains that turned purple in the fading light, and she could smell creosote and dust and something else, something clean and open that she realized was just the scent of the desert itself. "You can tell me your name if you want," Daniel said after a while, his voice rumbling through his chest and into her back. "Or you can make one up. Mrs. Hartfield will not care either way." "Martha," she said, and then because it felt important to give him something real, she added, "Martha Calloway. I came from Santa Fe. Long way from home. I do not have a home anymore." The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest, and she felt Daniel shift slightly behind her. "Well then, maybe you will find a new one," he said, and there was no pity in his voice, just a matter-of-fact acceptance that she found oddly comforting. They rode in silence for a while longer, and Martha watched as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. She had not allowed herself to feel much of anything in the past week, too focused on survival and escape to process the loss and betrayal and fear that churned inside her. But now, in this quiet moment with a stranger's kindness surrounding her, she felt something crack open in her chest. She blinked hard against the sudden burning in her eyes, and was grateful that Daniel could not see her face. The Triple Crown Ranch appeared gradually, first as lights in the distance and then as a collection of buildings that resolved into a large 2-story house, several barns, and various outbuildings. Even in the growing darkness, Martha could see that this was a prosperous operation, well-maintained and substantial. and she felt a flutter of nervousness about meeting the woman who owned it all. Daniel rode straight up to the main house and dismounted, then reached up to help Martha down, his hands steady at her waist. "Wait here just a moment," he said, and bounded up the porch steps to knock on the door. The woman who answered was not what Martha expected. Eleanor Hartfield was perhaps 50 years old, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a simple bun, and a face that was handsome rather than pretty, with strong features and intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She wore a practical dress in deep blue and an apron that suggested she had been cooking, and when she saw Daniel, her face lit up with obvious affection. "Daniel, you are back late. I was beginning to worry." Then her gaze moved past him to Martha, and her expression shifted to curiosity and concern. "Who is this?" "This is Miss Martha Calloway. I found her at the edge of town with nowhere to go. I was hoping you might have room for a guest tonight." Daniel's voice held a note of quiet pleading that suggested he did not make such requests often. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch and studied Martha with sharp eyes that nonetheless held warmth. "You look exhausted, child, and hungry, unless I miss my guess. Of course you can stay. Come inside, both of you." The interior of the house was warm and welcoming, with polished wood floors and sturdy furniture that looked comfortable rather than fancy. Martha could smell something delicious cooking, some kind of stew or soup, and her stomach growled audibly. Eleanor led them into a large kitchen, where a pot bubbled on the stove, and she immediately began ladling food into bowls while gesturing for Martha to sit at the scarred wooden table. "Daniel, get our guests some water, and then you should eat too before you see to the horses." Eleanor set a bowl of thick beef stew in front of Martha, along with fresh bread and butter, and Martha had to restrain herself from falling on the food like a starving animal. She forced herself to eat slowly, even though every cell in her body screamed for sustenance, and she was aware of both Daniel and Eleanor watching her with a combination of concern and something that looked like understanding. "When did you last eat?" Eleanor asked, sitting down across from Martha with her own bowl. "Yesterday morning," Martha admitted, and that was only partially true because the food she had managed to get then had been a single roll that she had made last as long as possible. Eleanor and Daniel exchanged a look, and then Eleanor said firmly, "Well, you are safe now, and you will eat your fill. Daniel says you came from Santa Fe. That is quite a journey." Martha nodded, not trusting herself to speak around the lump in her throat, and Eleanor seemed to sense that this was not the time for questions. They ate in companionable silence, and Martha felt some of the terrible tension in her shoulders begin to ease. When she had finished 2 bowls of stew and half a loaf of bread, Eleanor showed her upstairs to a small but clean bedroom with a real bed and fresh linens and a wash basin with actual clean water. "The necessary is out back, and there is a pump in the kitchen if you need more water in the morning," Eleanor said. "Sleep as long as you need. We will talk tomorrow about what comes next, if you want to talk. If you do not, that is fine too. You are safe here, Martha. I want you to know that." After Eleanor left, Martha sat on the edge of the bed and let herself cry for the first time since leaving Santa Fe, great gulping sobs that shook her whole body and left her exhausted but somehow cleansed. She washed her face in the basin, changed into her only nightgown, and crawled between the clean sheets with a sense of gratitude so profound it was almost painful. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Daniel Reeves and his gray-green eyes and the way he had said, "Climb up, I know a place," as though it was the most natural thing in the world to help a stranger in need. Martha woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of roosters crowing, and for a moment she could not remember where she was. Then it all came back in a rush, the stagecoach and redemption and Daniel Reeves and this unexpected sanctuary. She sat up slowly, her body aching from days of hard travel and stress, and looked around the simple room with its whitewashed walls and braided rug and single wooden chair. There was a pitcher of fresh water on the washstand that had not been there last night, and a clean towel folded beside it, and Martha felt her throat tighten at this small kindness from a woman who owed her nothing. She washed and dressed in her only other dress, a simple brown calico that was showing wear but was at least clean, and braided her dark blonde hair into a practical plait that hung down her back. When she made her way downstairs, following the smell of coffee and bacon, she found Eleanor in the kitchen frying eggs while a young Mexican woman kneaded bread dough at the counter. "Good morning," Eleanor said cheerfully. "I hope you slept well. This is Rosa. She helps me with the house and cooking. Rosa, this is Miss Martha." Rosa smiled warmly and said something in Spanish that Martha did not understand, but that sounded welcoming. Eleanor handed Martha a cup of coffee and gestured for her to sit. "The men eat early and are already out working, but I saved you a proper breakfast. You still look half-starved." As Martha ate scrambled eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits with honey, Eleanor busied herself with various tasks, giving her space but maintaining a comfortable presence. Finally, when Martha had cleaned her plate, Eleanor poured them both more coffee and sat down across from her with a direct look that was not unkind but was clearly seeking truth. "I am not going to pry into your business, Martha, but I do need to know a few things if you are going to stay here even temporarily. Are you running from the law?" "No," Martha said firmly. "I have not committed any crime." "Are you running from a husband?" "I am not married." Eleanor studied her face. "But you are running from a man." It was not a question, and Martha saw no point in lying. "Yes, a man who made promises he never intended to keep, and whose wife decided I was a threat that needed to be eliminated. She tried to have me arrested on false charges. I left before she could make good on her threat." "Smart girl." Eleanor's voice held approval rather than judgment. "Men like that are a dime a dozen out here, and the wives who blame the other woman instead of their lying husbands are even more common. You did the right thing getting out." She paused, then asked gently, "Are you with child?" Martha felt her face flame, but she met Eleanor's eyes steadily. "No." "Thank God." "And no, but my reputation is ruined, and I have no references and no prospects. I had hoped to find work in Redemption, but I can see now that was foolish." "Redemption is not much of a town," Eleanor agreed, "but the Triple Crown is always looking for help if you are willing to work. I could use someone to help Rosa with the house and the cooking, and during busy seasons we need extra hands in the kitchen for feeding the ranch hands. It would not be glamorous work, but it would be honest wages and a roof over your head, and 3 meals a day. What do you say?" Martha stared at her, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would hire me, just like that? You do not even know me." "I know you were sitting at the edge of town with nowhere to go, and you did not try to lie or manipulate when I asked you direct questions. I know Daniel thought you were worth helping, and that boy has good instincts about people. And I know what it is like to be a woman alone in a hard world, needing a chance that nobody wants to give you." Eleanor's voice softened. 30 years ago, I was in a situation not so different from yours. A man made promises, I believed him, and when things went wrong, I was the one left holding the consequences. I was lucky enough to find work with a rancher who did not judge me, and eventually I married his foreman, and we built this place together. When he died 5 years ago, he left it all to me, and I have been running it ever since. So, yes, I am offering you a job, Martha Calloway. The question is whether you want to take it." Martha felt tears prick her eyes again, and she wiped them away impatiently. Yes, I want to take it. Thank you. I will work hard. I promise you that." "I believe you," Eleanor said, and reached across the table to pat Martha's hand. "Welcome to the Triple Crown." The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Martha learned the rhythms of ranch life. She rose before dawn to help Rosa prepare breakfast for the dozen ranch hands who worked the property, and she spent her days cleaning and cooking and learning the 1,000 small tasks that kept a household running. The work was hard and her hands blistered and her back ached, but it was honest labor, and she felt a satisfaction in it that she had not felt in a long time. Eleanor was a fair but demanding boss, expecting excellence but also offering patient instruction, and Rosa became a friend despite the language barrier, teaching Martha Spanish words and laughing at her terrible pronunciation. But it was Daniel Reeves who occupied far too many of Martha's thoughts, though she tried to keep herself too busy to notice. She saw him at mealtimes when he came in with the other hands, always polite and friendly, but not presumptuous. And sometimes in the evenings he would sit on the porch with Eleanor discussing ranch business while Martha cleaned up the kitchen. She found herself listening for his voice, watching for glimpses of him through the window as he worked with the horses or rode out to check the cattle, and she told herself firmly that this was foolish and dangerous and exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten her into trouble in Santa Fe. Daniel Reeves was not Richard Thornton, some calculating voice in her head insisted. Daniel had helped her without expecting anything in return, had been nothing but respectful and kind, and there was something about him that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in years. But Martha had learned the hard way that her judgment about men could not be trusted, and she was determined not to make the same mistake twice. So she kept her distance and focused on her work and tried to ignore the way her heart skipped when he smiled at her across the dinner table. About 2 weeks after her arrival, Eleanor sent Martha into redemption with a list of supplies that needed to be picked up from the general store. Daniel drove the wagon, and Martha sat beside him on the bench seat, acutely aware of his presence and trying to think of something to say that would not sound idiotic. Daniel solved the problem by keeping up an easy stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about the area and the people who lived there, and gradually Martha felt herself relaxing into the rhythm of his voice. "That ridge there, that is where I first saw the Triple Crown," he said, gesturing to a rocky outcrop. "I had been walking for 3 days with no food and barely any water, and I climbed up there just to see if I could spot any signs of civilization. When I saw the ranch buildings, I thought I was hallucinating. Took me another 6 hours to make it down there, and by the time I arrived, I was in bad shape." "Where were you coming from?" Martha asked, genuinely curious. "Texas originally. My parents died of fever when I was 14, and I ended up with an uncle who saw me as free labor and treated me accordingly. I ran away when I was 16 and headed west, figuring anything had to be better than staying there. I was wrong about that. Turned out there are a lot of ways to suffer in this world, but eventually I got lucky and ended up at the Triple Crown." He glanced at her with a self-deprecating smile. "Mrs. Hartfield saved my life. I do not say that as an exaggeration. Another day or two, and I would have died out there in the desert. She is a remarkable woman," Martha said softly. "She is. She sees people for who they are, not for what society says they should be. That is a rare quality." Daniel paused, then added carefully, "She told me a little bit about your situation. Not details, just enough to explain why you needed help. I want you to know that I think you were brave to leave, and smart to take the chance on coming here." Martha felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, but she kept her voice light. "I did not have many other options. Maybe, but you could have stayed and fought false charges, or you could have tried to appease people who wanted to hurt you. Instead, you chose to start over, even though that meant leaving everything behind. That takes courage." He looked at her directly, and the sincerity in his gray-green eyes made her breath catch. "I know what it is like to run from a bad situation, Martha, and I know what it is like to wonder if you will ever find a place where you belong. I just want you to know that you are not alone in that." They arrived in redemption before Martha could formulate a response, and the moment was lost in the bustle of tying up the wagon and heading into the general store. Mr. Peterson, the store owner, was a balding man with a generous mustache and a friendly manner, and he greeted Daniel like an old friend before turning his attention to Martha with curious but not unkind eyes. "Miss Calloway is working up at the Triple Crown now," Daniel explained, handing over Eleanor's list. "We will need all of this loaded up when you have a chance." Of course, of course. Welcome to redemption, Miss Calloway. Any friend of the Hartfield Ranch is a friend of mine." Mr. Peterson bustled off to gather supplies, and Martha found herself wandering the aisles, looking at bolts of fabric and jars of candy and all the small luxuries she could not afford. She was examining a beautiful length of blue calico when a voice behind her said, "That color would look lovely on you." Martha turned to find a woman about her own age, with auburn hair and freckles and a friendly smile. "Thank you," Martha said cautiously. "I am Sarah Wilson. My father runs the bank across the street, and I help him with the bookkeeping. I heard that Mrs. Hartfield had taken on a new girl. It is nice to meet you." "Martha Calloway, nice to meet you too." Sarah glanced around conspiratorially, then lowered her voice. "I also heard that Daniel Reeves found you at the edge of town and brought you to the ranch. Is that true?" Martha felt defensive walls rising, but forced herself to stay calm. "Yes, that is true. He was kind enough to help when I needed it." "Oh, I did not mean anything improper by asking," Sarah said quickly, her face flushing. "It is just that, well, Daniel is something of a hero around here. He helped my father run off some men who were trying to rob the bank last year, and he never makes a fuss about it, but he is always helping people. Half the single women in the territory would marry him in a heartbeat, but he does not seem interested in any of them. I was just curious about you, is all." Martha did not know what to say to that, so she just smiled politely and turned back to examining the fabric. Sarah took the hint and wandered off after a few more pleasantries, leaving Martha alone with her spinning thoughts. Daniel as the local hero who had half the women chasing him. Of course he did. He was handsome and capable and genuinely kind, exactly the sort of man who would attract attention. Martha told herself firmly that this information changed nothing, that she was in no position to think about romance or relationships or anything beyond getting her life back in order. But she could not quite shake the small flutter of something in her chest when she thought about the way Daniel had said her name. They loaded the supplies into the wagon and headed back to the ranch. And this time, the silence between them felt different, charged with something Martha could not quite name. She snuck glances at Daniel's profile as he drove, noting the strong line of his jaw and the way the wind ruffled his dark hair, and she found herself wondering what it would be like to be courted by a man like this, someone genuine and honest and good. Then she remembered Richard Thornton and how convinced she had been that he was all those things too, and she pushed the thoughts away with ruthless determination. But over the following weeks, despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance, Martha found herself drawn more and more to Daniel Reeves. He had a way of showing up when she needed help, carrying heavy pots or reaching high shelves or fixing broken things without being asked. He told jokes that made her laugh despite herself, and he listened when she talked with an attention that suggested he actually cared what she had to say. He treated the horses with gentle patience and the other ranch hands with respect, and she never heard him raise his voice in anger or speak cruelly about anyone. One evening in late spring, after the dinner dishes were washed and put away, Martha stepped out onto the back porch for a breath of fresh air and found Daniel there, sitting on the steps and looking up at the stars. He glanced over when he heard the door and smiled. "Evening. Finished with your work. Finally, Rosa is teaching me to make tamales tomorrow, and I am both excited and terrified." Martha sat down on the step beside him, leaving a respectable distance between them. "What are you doing out here?" "Just thinking, watching the stars. It is peaceful out here at night." He gestured to the vast sky above them, spangled with more stars than Martha had ever seen in her life. "You can see the whole universe from out here. Makes your problems seem smaller somehow." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Martha felt the tension of the day drain from her shoulders. The desert night was cool, and the air smelled of sage, and she could hear the distant sound of cattle lowing, and closer by, the chirp of crickets. It was so different from her life in Santa Fe, from the noise and the crowds and the constant feeling of being watched and judged. Out here she could breathe. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said, breaking the silence. When Martha nodded, he continued carefully. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving Santa Fe, coming here, starting over?" Martha considered the question seriously. "No, I regret the circumstances that made it necessary, and I regret trusting someone I should not have trusted. But coming here, that was the right choice. Eleanor gave me a chance when no one else would, and I have honest work and a safe place to sleep and friends. That is more than I had in Santa Fe, even before everything went wrong." "I am glad," Daniel said simply. "You seem happier now than when I first met you, less haunted." "I was pretty haunted that day," Martha admitted with a wry smile. "Sitting at the edge of town, with nowhere to go, thinking my life was effectively over. And then you rode up and said, 'Climb up, I know a place,' like it was nothing. Like helping a desperate stranger was just something you did." "It was something I did," Daniel said, and there was something in his voice that made Martha turn to look at him. "Martha, I need to tell you something, and I hope it does not make things awkward between us." Her heart started to pound, but she forced herself to stay calm. "All right. That day I found you, it was not chance. I mean, it was chance that you were there at that moment, but I had ridden into town specifically to clear my head because I had been feeling restless and dissatisfied for weeks. I could not figure out what was wrong, just that something was missing from my life. And then I saw you sitting there, looking lost and scared, but also determined, and it was like something clicked into place. I wanted to help you, yes, but it was more than that. I wanted to know you. I have wanted to know you ever since. But I have been trying to be respectful and give you space because I know you have been through something difficult, and probably the last thing you need is some cowboy making unwanted advances." Martha's breath caught in her throat. "Daniel, let me finish," he said gently. "I am not asking you for anything, Martha. I am not expecting anything. I just wanted you to know that I care about you, more than I probably should, given that we have only known each other a couple of months. You make me laugh, and you work harder than anyone I have ever met, and you are kind to everyone even when you are exhausted. You are brave and smart and beautiful. And if you never feel the same way about me, that is all right. I will still be your friend, and I will still be glad I found you that day. But I thought you should know how I feel. Martha sat frozen, her mind racing. A part of her wanted to run, to protect herself from the possibility of more pain and betrayal and disappointment. But a larger part, a part that was tired of being afraid, wanted to stay right where she was and see what happened next. She thought about the past 2 months, about all the small kindnesses Daniel had shown her, about the way he made her feel safe and valued and seen. She thought about the difference between Richard Thornton's smooth lies and Daniel Reeves's honest vulnerability. And she thought about the fact that she was already halfway in love with him, had been fighting it for weeks, and maybe it was time to stop fighting. I feel the same way, she said quietly, and watched his face transform with hope and joy. I have been trying not to because I was scared, because the last man I trusted hurt me badly, and I did not want to make that mistake again. But you are not him, Daniel. You have shown me that over and over. You are good and honest, and everything I did not know I was looking for. Can I hold your hand? Daniel asked, and the fact that he asked permission made Martha's heart swell. Yes, she said, and slipped her hand into his larger, calloused one. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped and shoulders touching, looking up at the stars and not needing to say anything more. Martha felt something settle deep in her chest, some knot of fear and anxiety loosening, and she allowed herself to feel the happiness that was blooming inside her. This was real, she told herself. This was different. This was a man who would not make promises he could not keep. Their courtship unfolded slowly over the summer months, with Eleanor's amused approval and Rose's delighted encouragement. Daniel would find excuses to be near Martha during the day, helping her hang laundry, or walking with her when she went to gather eggs. In the evenings they would sit on the porch and talk for hours, sharing stories from their pasts and dreams for their futures. He told her about his parents, about the happy early years before the fever took them, and about the uncle who had beaten him for the smallest infractions. She told him about growing up in an orphanage in St. Louis, about learning to sew from the nuns who ran the place, and about the desperate hope that had driven her west to Santa Fe, seeking a better life. "Do you think we would have found each other if I had not been sitting at that edge of town?" Martha asked one night as they walked along the fence line, the moon bright enough to light their path. "I think we would have found each other somehow," Daniel said. "Maybe not that day or in that way, but eventually. Some things are just meant to be." "I did not used to believe in meant to be," Martha said. "I thought life was just random chance and bad luck and making the best of whatever happened. But maybe I was wrong." Daniel stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Martha Calloway, I am not a rich man, and I probably never will be. I am just a ranch hand with a good horse and a steady job, and a little bit of money saved. But I love you with everything I am, and I promise you I will spend the rest of my life trying to make you happy if you will let me. Will you marry me?" Martha looked up at him, at his sincere face and hopeful eyes, and the moonlight turning his skin silver, and she felt absolutely certain, in a way she had never felt about anything before. Yes, I will marry you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, and Martha wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the love and hope and gratitude that filled her heart. When they finally broke apart, both breathless and grinning, Daniel said, "I should probably ask Eleanor for her blessing, since she is kind of like your employer and guardian rolled into one." "I think she has been waiting for you to propose for weeks," Martha said with a laugh. "She keeps making comments about how I should make sure to hem my dresses properly, because a bride needs to look her best." They walked back to the house hand in hand, and found Eleanor sitting on the porch with a cup of tea and a knowing smile. "About time," she said when they told her their news. "I was beginning to think you two would dance around each other forever. Of course you have my blessing, Daniel. I cannot think of anyone I would rather see Martha marry." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Redemption, with Eleanor and Rosa and half the town in attendance. Martha wore a dress she had sewn herself from the blue calico she had admired in the general store, which Daniel had secretly bought and given to her as an engagement gift. Sarah Wilson stood up as her bridesmaid, having become a genuine friend over the summer, and one of the other ranch hands stood up for Daniel. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, and Daniel kissed her in front of everyone, Martha felt a joy so complete it was almost overwhelming. Eleanor had insisted on hosting a reception at the ranch, and the main house was filled with food and music and laughter. Daniel danced with Martha in the parlor while someone played fiddle, and she leaned her head against his chest and thought about how far she had come, from that desperate woman sitting at the edge of town with nowhere to go. She had a husband now, a good man who loved her, and she had friends and meaningful work and a place where she belonged. It felt like a miracle. Daniel had spent the past weeks fixing up one of the small cottages on the ranch property for them to live in, and that night he carried Martha over the threshold of their new home with a grin that made her laugh. The cottage was modest but cozy, with a bedroom and a small living area and a kitchen, and Martha could see all the careful touches Daniel had added: curtains in the windows, a braided rug on the floor, wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reeves," he said, setting her down gently. "Mrs. Reeves," Martha repeated, trying out the name. "I like the sound of that." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous and eager, and so full of love for each other that every touch felt sacred. Daniel was patient and gentle, and Martha felt safe in a way she had never felt with Richard Thornton's hurried and selfish demands. This was what intimacy was supposed to be, she realized, two people giving to each other freely and with joy. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, and Daniel traced patterns on her bare shoulder and told her again how much he loved her. "I am going to spend every day making sure you never regret saying yes to me," he murmured into her hair. "I could never regret it," Martha said. "You saved me, Daniel, in every way a person can be saved." The first year of their marriage passed in a blur of happiness and hard work and deepening love. Martha continued to help Eleanor and Rosa with the house while also taking care of her own home and learning all the skills of being a ranch wife. Daniel worked long days but always made time for her, and their evenings together became the highlight of both their days. They would sit on their small porch and watch the sunsets paint the sky in impossible colors, and they would talk about their hopes for the future. "I want children someday," Martha said one evening in the spring of 1882, almost a year after their wedding. "A whole house full of them, if we are lucky." "I want that too," Daniel agreed. "Though maybe we could start with just one and see how we manage." He paused, then asked carefully, "Are you telling me something, Martha?" She smiled and placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "I am telling you that by Christmas you are going to be a father." Daniel's whoop of joy startled the horses in the nearby corral, and he picked Martha up and spun her around despite her laughing protests to be careful. He set her down and immediately began fussing over her, insisting she should sit down and rest and not lift anything heavy. And Martha had to remind him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities for the foreseeable future. But she loved his protectiveness, loved the way his face lit up every time he looked at her growing belly, loved how he would talk to the baby at night and tell their unborn child stories about the ranch and the stars. Eleanor and Rosa were thrilled, immediately beginning to knit blankets and sew tiny clothes, and Sarah Wilson threw Martha a small party where the women of redemption welcomed her into the secret society of mothers and shared advice both helpful and absurd. The baby came on a cold December night during a rare snowstorm that blanketed the desert in white. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Martha was certain she could not endure another contraction. But Eleanor and Rosa and the midwife from town all stayed with her, coaching her through, and Daniel held her hand and told her she was the bravest person he had ever known. Finally, after 18 hours of struggle, their son came into the world with a lusty cry that filled the cottage with sound. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the tiny red-faced bundle on Martha's chest, "and a healthy one, by the sound of him." Martha looked down at her son through tears of exhaustion and overwhelming love, and Daniel leaned over them both with wonder written across his face. "He is perfect," Daniel whispered. "You are perfect. I love you so much." They named him Thomas Daniel Reeves after Daniel's father, and as a nod to his own name, and from the moment he was born, Thomas became the center of their universe. He was a happy baby, with Daniel's dark hair and Martha's blue eyes, and he seemed to grow bigger every day. Daniel was a devoted father, coming home from work to hold his son and sing to him in a surprisingly pleasant voice, and Martha would watch them together and feel her heart expand with love for both her boys. Life settled into a new rhythm with Thomas, busier and more chaotic, but filled with even more joy. The cottage that had seemed perfectly sized for 2 adults felt suddenly cramped with the addition of a baby and all his necessary equipment, and after a particularly hectic evening, trying to bathe Thomas in a basin in the kitchen while also making dinner, Martha mentioned to Daniel that maybe they should think about adding a room. "I have been thinking the same thing," Daniel admitted. "In fact, I have been talking to Mrs. Hartfield about it. She owns this cottage technically since it is on ranch land, but she said if we wanted to expand it, she would pay for the materials if I did the labor. What would you think about adding a bedroom for Thomas, and maybe making the main room a bit larger?" "I think that sounds wonderful," Martha said, bouncing Thomas on her hip. "Though I do not want you working yourself to exhaustion trying to do it all alone. Some of the other hands have offered to help. We could probably get it done in a month or 2 if we work on it during the evenings and on Sundays." Daniel reached over to take Thomas, who immediately grabbed his father's nose and giggled. "What do you think, little man? Want your own room?" The project took longer than anticipated, as projects always do. But by the time Thomas was a year old, the cottage had been transformed into a proper small house with 2 bedrooms and a larger living area. Martha planted a garden in the front yard, and Daniel built a small fence to keep it safe from wandering livestock. It was not grand or fancy, but it was theirs, and Martha loved every inch of it. When Thomas was 2 years old, Martha discovered she was pregnant again, and this time the pregnancy was easier, even though she was chasing a busy toddler around. Their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor Rose after the woman who had given them both a chance at a new life, arrived on a beautiful spring morning with far less drama than her brother. She was tiny and delicate with wispy blonde hair and Daniel's gray-green eyes, and Thomas was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to help feed her or bring her toys. Daniel had been steadily moving up in responsibility at the Triple Crown, and Eleanor had made him her foreman the year before, which came with better pay and more authority. He was good at the job, fair with the men, and smart about managing the cattle and horses, and the ranch prospered under his leadership. Martha had largely stopped working in the big house after Thomas was born, but she still helped Rosa during busy times and considered Eleanor family rather than just an employer. The years passed in a blur of children and work and love. When Ellie was 3, Martha had another baby, a boy they named James, who had Martha's blonde hair and a sunny disposition that charmed everyone he met. Daniel built another addition onto the house, giving the children more space, and Martha found herself living a life she had never imagined possible when she was sitting at the edge of redemption with nowhere to go. One evening, when Thomas was 7 and Ellie was 5 and James was 2, the family sat together on their porch watching the sunset. Thomas was reading aloud from a book, practicing the skills he was learning at the small school that had recently opened in Redemption, while Ellie played with a cornhusk doll and James dozed in Martha's lap. Daniel reached over and took Martha's free hand, squeezing it gently. "Happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from her smile. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Martha said honestly. "Sometimes I still think about that day, you know, when you found me and brought me here. It feels like a lifetime ago." 8 years, Daniel said, doing the math. 8 years and 3 children and a life I would not trade for anything. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had not ridden through town that day? If you had taken a different route or decided to go another time?" Martha asked. "Sometimes. But then I remember what I said to you back when we were courting. I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "You are my meant to be, Martha Reeves." Eleanor Hartfield passed away peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1890 at the age of 65. She left the Triple Crown Ranch to Daniel and Martha in her will, along with a letter telling them that they had become the children she never had and that she knew the ranch would thrive under their care. The funeral was attended by everyone in the county, a testament to the lives Eleanor had touched, and Martha cried as much for the loss of her friend and mentor as for the woman who had saved her when she had nowhere else to go. Running the ranch was a huge responsibility, but Daniel and Martha rose to the challenge together. They hired more hands and expanded the operation, breeding quality horses in addition to raising cattle. Martha took over the business end of things, keeping the books and managing supplies and proving to have a sharp head for numbers. The children grew up working on the ranch, learning the value of hard work and the satisfaction of a job well done. Thomas grew into a serious young man, with his father's work ethic and his mother's compassion. Ellie was spirited and adventurous, always pushing boundaries and testing limits in ways that both exasperated and delighted her parents. James was the peacemaker, easygoing and friendly, beloved by everyone who met him. In 1892, Martha had one more baby, another girl they named Sarah after Martha's friend, who had since married and moved to Arizona, but who had remained close despite the distance. Life on the ranch was not always easy. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and horse injuries, financial worries, and the constant challenge of keeping a large operation running smoothly. But through it all, Daniel and Martha faced every challenge as partners, their love for each other deepening with each passing year. They still sat on their porch in the evenings when time allowed, still held hands and talked about their day, still looked at each other with the same wonder and gratitude they had felt in those early days. When Thomas turned 18 in 1898, he announced his intention to go to college in the East, wanting to study agriculture and animal husbandry so he could bring modern techniques back to the ranch. Martha's heart broke a little at the thought of him leaving, but she and Daniel supported his dreams and sent him off with their blessing and enough money to see him through. Ellie declared her intention to stay and help run the ranch, having no interest in leaving the only home she had ever known. And Martha recognized her younger self in her daughter's fierce independence and determination. The new century arrived with celebration and hope, and Martha stood on the porch of the ranch house that was now officially theirs and marveled at how much had changed since that desperate day in 1881 when a cowboy had said, "Climb up, I know a place." She was 41 years old now, with silver beginning to thread through her blonde hair and lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But she had never felt more beautiful or more loved. Daniel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "Everything? The past 20 years, the children, this life we built together. How lucky I am." She turned in his arms to face him. "How lucky we are." "The luckiest," Daniel agreed, and kissed her with all the passion and tenderness of their early days. Thomas returned from college in 1902 with a degree and a wife, a smart and pretty young woman named Catherine who fit into the family as though she had always been there. They moved into one of the cottages on the property, and Thomas took over much of the day-to-day running of the ranch, implementing the modern techniques he had learned and increasing their profits substantially. In 1903, he made Daniel and Martha grandparents with the birth of a son they named Daniel Thomas Reeves, and Martha held her grandson and felt the circle of life complete itself in the most satisfying way. Ellie met a cowboy named Jack Morrison when she was 23, a good man who worked on a neighboring ranch and who was not at all intimidated by her strong will and sharp tongue. They married in 1904, and Jack came to work at the Triple Crown, and Ellie continued to be as involved in the running of the ranch as she had always been. James showed an interest in the business side of things, working closely with Martha on the accounts, and proving to have inherited her head for numbers, and young Sarah was still in school, but showing signs of becoming a talented horse trainer. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow, as all years do. Martha lost her friend Sarah Wilson to influenza in 1905, and Daniel's old friend from his early ranch hand days was killed in a riding accident in 1907. But there were also births and weddings and celebrations, the constant renewal that is the gift of a large and growing family. The Triple Crown prospered and gained a reputation throughout New Mexico territory as one of the best-run ranches in the region, and Daniel and Martha were respected as fair and honest business people who treated their employees well. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1911, Daniel surprised Martha by taking her back to Redemption, to the exact spot at the edge of town where he had first found her. The town had grown considerably in the intervening years. No longer just a dusty collection of buildings, but a thriving community with a real hotel and multiple stores and even a small theater. But the rock where Martha had sat all those years ago was still there, and Daniel led her to it with a mysterious smile. "Sit," he instructed, and when she did, he stepped back and looked at her. She stood at the edge of town with nowhere to go, he said softly, repeating words he had said 3 decades before. The cowboy said, "Climb up, I know a place. Martha felt tears prick her eyes at the memory. That was the day my life began, the real life, the good one. Mine too, Daniel said, and pulled her to her feet. I brought you here because I wanted to remember where we started, and to tell you that even knowing everything that would come after, all the hard times and the losses and the struggles, I would do it all again in a heartbeat for the privilege of loving you. Daniel Reeves, after 30 years of marriage, you can still make me cry like a schoolgirl, Martha said, wiping her eyes. I love you. I have loved you since that first night at the Triple Crown, when you sat on the steps looking at the stars and told me your story. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that. They stood together at the edge of town that was no longer really the edge of anything, holding each other and remembering, and Martha felt profound gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought her to this place at exactly the right moment to meet exactly the right person. It had not been chance after all, she thought. It had been destiny. The children gave them a party at the ranch that evening, and the whole county seemed to turn out to celebrate Daniel and Martha Reeves and their 30 years of marriage. There were speeches and toasts and more food than anyone could possibly eat. And Daniel danced with Martha in the same parlor where they had danced at their wedding, and she laid her head on his chest and listened to his heartbeat and thought that this, right here, was everything she had ever wanted. As the evening wound down and the guests began to leave, their 4 children gathered around with their spouses and the 6 grandchildren who had arrived by then, and Thomas raised his glass one more time. To our parents, who showed us what real love looks like and who built something lasting out of nothing but hard work and devotion to each other. May we all be half as lucky as you two have been. Hear, hear, everyone echoed, and Martha looked around at the faces of her family. All these people who existed because a cowboy had stopped to help a desperate woman at the edge of town, and she felt her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. Daniel and Martha continued to be active in running the ranch well into their 60s, though they gradually turned over more and more responsibility to Thomas and Ellie and their spouses. They became the patriarch and matriarch of a growing family, the wise ones that the younger generation came to for advice and comfort. Martha taught her granddaughters to sew and cook and manage a household, while Daniel taught his grandsons to ride and rope and care for the animals. But more than any practical skill, they taught all of them about love and commitment and the importance of helping others when you see someone in need. In 1920, New Mexico officially became a state rather than a territory, and the Reeves family celebrated along with everyone else in the region. The world was changing rapidly, with automobiles becoming common and electricity spreading even to rural areas, but the rhythms of ranch life remained largely the same. The children had children of their own, and the Triple Crown continued to thrive under the 3rd generation of family management. On a warm summer evening in 1925, 44 years after that fateful day in redemption, Daniel and Martha sat on the porch of their home, surrounded by 3 generations of family. Thomas was there with Catherine and their 4 children and 2 grandchildren. Ellie was there with Jack and their 3 children. James had married a teacher from town and had 2 daughters who were both studying to be nurses. Sarah had become one of the finest horse trainers in the state and had married a veterinarian, and together they had a son and twin daughters. Martha looked out at all these people, all this love and life that had come from a single moment of kindness, and she reached over to take Daniel's hand. He squeezed it and smiled at her, and in his eyes she could still see the young cowboy who had offered to help a stranger because someone had once helped him. His hair was white now, and his face was deeply lined from decades in the sun. But to Martha, he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "No regrets?" he asked softly, a question he had asked her many times over the years. "Not a single one," Martha answered, as she always did. "You gave me everything, Daniel. A home and a family and a life worth living. You saved me." "We saved each other," Daniel corrected gently. "I was just as lost as you were that day. I just did not know it yet. You gave me purpose and love, and a reason to be better than I thought I could be." As the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange, Martha leaned against her husband's shoulder and listened to the sound of her family laughing and talking around them. This was her legacy, she thought. Not just the ranch or the money or the land, but these people and the love that bound them together. This was what happened when someone said, "Climb up, I know a place," and meant it with their whole heart. Daniel and Martha lived to see their 50th wedding anniversary in 1931, a milestone that was celebrated with even more fanfare than their 30th. By then, they had 12 grandchildren and 7 great-grandchildren, and the Triple Crown Ranch was one of the most successful operations in the entire state. They were both slowing down with age, content to sit on the porch and watch the younger generations do the hard work. But their minds were still sharp, and their love for each other had only grown stronger with time. Martha passed away peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1933, at the age of 74, with Daniel holding her hand. Her last words to him were, "I love you, Cowboy. Thank you for stopping that day." Daniel mourned her deeply, but took comfort in knowing that they had lived a full and beautiful life together, and that she had died surrounded by the family they had built and the love they had shared. Daniel lived another 3 years after Martha's death, increasingly frail, but still mentally present and still taking joy in his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He told stories of the early days, of finding Martha at the edge of town and bringing her to the Triple Crown, of their courtship and wedding and all the years that followed. He wanted to make sure the family knew their history, understood where they came from, and the love that had made it all possible. On a cool November evening in 1936, Daniel Reeves passed away at the age of 80, with all 4 of his children at his bedside. His last words were, "Tell Martha I am coming home," and there was a smile on his face when he took his final breath. They buried him next to Martha in the family cemetery on the ranch, under a large oak tree that Daniel had planted years before, because Martha loved the shade it provided. The headstones were simple but eloquent. Martha Calloway Reeves, 1859 to 1933, beloved wife, mother, and grandmother, and Daniel Thomas Reeves, 1856 to 1936, beloved husband, father, and grandfather. But someone, probably one of the grandchildren, had added a small bronze plaque between them that read, "She stood at the edge of town with nowhere to go. The cowboy said, 'Climb up, I know a place.' And together they built a home." The Triple Crown Ranch continued to thrive under the management of Thomas and Ellie and their children, and the story of Daniel and Martha became a family legend passed down through the generations. Their great-great-grandchildren would visit the cemetery and hear about the cowboy who stopped to help a desperate woman and the love story that followed, and they would understand that they existed because of a single moment of kindness on a dusty road in 1881. The cottage where Daniel and Martha had lived, the one that had started as a single room and been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, was preserved as a kind of family museum. The children kept Martha's sewing basket and Daniel's old saddle, the cradle that had rocked all 4 of their babies, and some of their grandchildren too, and the porch swing where they had sat together on thousands of evenings watching the sun set over the desert they had both come to love. Years turned into decades, and the world continued to change in ways that Daniel and Martha could never have imagined. But the values they had instilled in their family, the importance of kindness and hard work and love, remained constant across the generations. The Triple Crown Ranch survived the Great Depression and World War II, and all the challenges of the modern world, always run by members of the Reeves family who remembered where they came from. And on summer evenings, when the setting sun painted the New Mexico sky in impossible colors, if you stood very still near the old cemetery under the oak tree, you might almost hear the echo of 2 voices talking quietly, an old cowboy and his beloved wife, still keeping each other company as they had done for more than 50 years. They had started with nothing but each other and a willingness to take a chance on love, and they had built something that would last forever. The story of Daniel and Martha Reeves became a testament to the truth that sometimes the most ordinary moments can change everything, that a single act of kindness can ripple out across generations, and that love, real love, is the foundation upon which all good things are built. She had stood at the edge of town with nowhere to go, and he had said, "Climb up, I know a place." And together they had found home. In the end, that was all that mattered, not the ranch or the money or the legacy of success, but the simple fact that 2 broken people had found each other at exactly the right moment and had chosen to build a life together based on trust and respect and deep, abiding love. They had faced every challenge as partners, celebrated every joy together, and created a family that would carry their values forward long after they were gone. Their love story was not grand or dramatic in the way of fairy tales. There were no princes or castles, no dramatic rescues or impossible obstacles overcome. It was simply the story of two ordinary people who found each other when they both needed saving and who chose every single day for more than 50 years to keep choosing each other. It was the story of how a moment of compassion on a dusty road in 1881 had grown into a love that spanned decades and created a family that would endure for generations. And really, what could be more romantic than that? What could be more powerful than the simple truth that love, real love, the kind that shows up and does the work and stays even when things are hard, can transform everything? Daniel and Martha had proven that with their lives, and their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried that proof forward like a torch passed from hand to hand, generation to generation, a living testament to the power of two hearts that chose each other and never wavered. The desert wind still blows across the New Mexico landscape, carrying the scent of sage and dust and the promise of rain. The Triple Crown Ranch still stands, a testament to hard work and good management, and the solid foundation that Daniel and Martha built together. And somewhere in the space between memory and legend, a young cowboy still rides up to a woman sitting at the edge of town, and he still says, "Climb up, I know a place." And she still says yes, and their love story begins again and again and again, eternal as the stars they used to watch together from their porch, endless as the desert sky that had witnessed their joy. This was their legacy. Not just land or money or success, but love. Real, enduring, transformative love that had started with a simple act of kindness and had grown into something that would outlast them both. And as long as there were people who believed in the power of compassion and the possibility of second chances, and the simple truth that sometimes helping a stranger can change your whole life, the story of Daniel and Martha Reeves would continue to matter. She had stood at the edge of town with nowhere to go, and he had said, "Climb up, I know a place." And together they had found not just a place but a home, not just shelter but love, not just survival but a life rich with meaning and joy, and the kind of happiness that comes from building something beautiful with someone you trust completely. That was the story, that was the legacy, that was the love that endured beyond death, beyond time, beyond everything except the simple truth that some people are meant to find each other, and when they do, magic happens. And in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, especially in those early days of the American West, when life was hard and uncertain and death could come quickly, the story of Daniel and Martha was a reminder that kindness still mattered, that love could still triumph, and that sometimes the most broken people could heal each other if they were just brave enough to try. They had been brave enough. They had tried, and they had succeeded beyond measure, building a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would endure for generations. The story ends where it began, at the edge of a small town in New Mexico territory. But now, instead of despair, there is hope. Instead of loneliness, there is love. And instead of nowhere to go, there is home. Because a cowboy stopped to help when he did not have to, and a woman was brave enough to accept that help. And together, they proved that sometimes the best love stories are the ones that start with, "Climb up, I know a place," and end with, "Happily ever after." And they lived happily ever after, not because their life was perfect or easy or without challenges, but because they faced everything together, with love and commitment and the bone-deep certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be, with exactly who they were meant to be with. That was their truth, that was their story, that was their forever, and it was more than enough.